For 18 months, Elias Hartman had come to the cemetery in a rhythm so precise it had hardened into ritual. A visit every Friday, a bouquet of lilies, white always, never pink, and a slow, private liturgy of remembrance. The granite stone bore 2 names he had kissed with his eyes until their edges blurred, and he had learned to move around the hollows of his own days like a man who had surrendered to absence. He wore the wardrobe of mourning without theatricality, a coat that fit his frame as if it had been cut to carry weight, shoes that gleamed enough to be noticed on the marble paths, and a face practiced at not betraying the small, sharp hope that arrived sometimes and left faster than wind. This morning the river was low, and the bank smelled of wet earth and riverweed. A single lily petal clung to the inscription on the stone, as if resisting the inevitability of time. Elias stood and watched it tremble, feeling the old, familiar hollow, when a voice, small and steady, as though it had rehearsed itself 1,000 times to be heard by someone with polished shoes, said, "They live by the river near where I sleep." The words came from a place he had learned to ignore, the wrong side of the paths, the side where the town's light thinned, and where people were remembered only if their absence made a scene. He turned. A girl sat on the top of the bank, knees hugged to her chest, hair threaded with river grass, and a scarf tied like a banner to keep out the chill. She looked 11, she looked 14. Her age, like the color of her sneakers, was practical rather than ornamental. Her eyes did not beg, they measured. "Who are they?" Elias asked, immediately aware that his voice had gone hoarse, and aware also that the question he meant to ask, "How do they live? Where are they yours?" had to stay under a quieter hand. The girl reached into the pocket of an oversized jacket and drew out something folded with care, a page torn from a school newsletter, 2 small faces smiling from weathered photographs that Elias had kept in a drawer he rarely opened. He knew those faces. He had known them in infancy, and in 100 half-lit frames that glowed around the house he had not allowed himself to change. Emma and Sophie. His hands tightened around the lily stems until the green snapped slightly. "My name's Amani," the girl said. She watched him the way someone who had slept above the river watched the weather, without expectation of shelter. The river moved between them, indifferent and inevitable, the same body of water that had known his shoes and her bare feet. In the space of a breath, Elias felt something brittle inside him shift. He had accepted a version of the world in which those faces were gone, a tidy narrative folded with signatures and an undertaker's official language.
It was not that he had stopped loving them. No man could stop loving so completely. But he had become a man who allowed the world to tell him what grief should look like. Amani's single sentence was the first fissure. She spoke with economy, small words placed for maximum clarity. They come out sometimes. They go down to the river to throw stones. They laugh. They have a red kite with a tail like a scarf. I know their backs from the laundromat days when their mother used to hang the sheets. Their faces are like this. She tapped the page. Elias felt a surge that was not yet hope, but a disobedient warmth that tasted like adrenaline and guilt. For months, funeral records, police summaries, certified documents had been the architecture of his grief. Now a voice from the bank, the kind of voice the city tends to erase, claimed to pull that architecture apart. Are you sure? He wanted more than belief. He wanted a concrete tether. He wanted to be necessary again. I saw them. I remember the girl with the ribbon, Amani said, naming something so private it might as well have been a password. When the storm came, they hid in the bushes. I saw them later with somebody I think was the lady with the yellow car. Her mouth tightened at the memory. I told the police once, but they said there was a paper that said they were gone. She did not ask for money or pity. She handed him a scrap of truth. Elias's fingers trembled. For a man who measured life in boardrooms and balances, the only currency that mattered now was certainty. He placed the lilies back in the grass, without straightening them, and without thinking through the steps that would follow, he said, "Stay where you are. I will come back." As he walked away, he felt ridiculous. The well-known, private laugh of the wealthy when faced with a human problem that didn't fit into spreadsheets. He had resources, people who knew how to make things move. But there was something else, a memory lodged under layers of resignation. The small smell of pancake batter on a child's shirt, a bedtime story that had once made a child laugh without reservation, the soft scrape of a tiny knee against the garden step. That smell mattered more than power. It was the smell of being a father. When he returned to the estate, the house swallowed him in its quiet. June, who had been with the family long enough to be a line in its architecture, took his coat without ceremony and set a cup of tea on the table. She looked at him not as a businessman, but as a man who had placed his grief on a shelf and tried to live on borrowed meaning. When he said the name Amani, June's face did not register surprise. There were things in a servant's life larger in their smallness. What people did at the river, who came to the neighborhood at night, which houses had lights that left the curtains open like sores. She sleeps in the lockbox by the old pump, June said. She comes for soup sometimes. She keeps to herself.
Elias did not sleep that night. He went through the rooms where his daughter's things rested like evidence. A shoe left under the piano, a crumpled drawing of a purple tree pinned to a corkboard. He took out a photograph album and turned pages with an avarice that felt almost obscene. The girls' faces were small and luminous in the old prints. In the margin of one picture, he found a stray hair ribbon he had carried in his wallet for months like a relic. He had folded his life so that this ribbon could be an anchor and not a wound. Now it felt like both. He called Thomas Knight late, and no one who had worked the discreet world of private security could be surprised into enthusiasm. Thomas arrived at dawn with a bag that smelled of electronics and the compact manner of a man who wore caution like armor. He watched Elias explain, listened to the recycled grief, the litany of small certainties twisted into something new. When Elias produced the torn page, Thomas did not speak the language of belief. He used the language he understood: observation, pattern, liability. There are practical steps, he said. We start with reconnaissance. We don't run in, we don't make a scene. We document, we find out who has seen what and how. Then counsel files for an emergency motion. If Amani will sign an affidavit, that'll buy us a hearing. Elias thought of the River Edge girl's hands, calloused, small, and of the legal world he had inhabited all his life. He phoned Marcus Bell before dawn. Marcus had been the family's lawyer for years, a steady man with the odor of trust about him, the kind of person who understood that law could be scaffolding for a life torn open. He did not say, of course, the way a loyal partner might. He asked clinical questions, then offered a plan. We need an affidavit. We'll want corroboration. A photograph, a time-stamped video would be helpful, but not definitive. Forensic review of the death certificates, a chain of custody audit from the coroner's office. We file for emergency custody, citing fresh eyewitness testimony and material doubts about the official record. Elias felt the machinery click into place, and with it, the cold knowledge that paper would now be the second language of his daughter's lives. It was a language he had used to build empires and to insulate himself from pain. Now it would be used to test the veracity of human memory. They began carefully because the world had to be convinced without giving Clarissa Hale, his ex-wife, the woman who had reported the accident and signed the narratives that had sealed the girl's fate, time to dress the stage. Thomas's men spent days mapping sightlines around the gray house with the red door, noting the creak of a gate, the rhythm of a gardener's truck. The house was the kind of place that existed in one neighborhood and belonged in another. A modest brick shell, a trimmed yard, a backyard that fell back towards the river like a secret.
The red door's paint had been refreshed within the last year. Someone had planted hydrangeas along the porch. It was not a mansion. It was a carefully curated anonymity. Amani came into the investigation the way a bone into a dog's life: necessary, prized, watched. Thomas's crew treated her with an adult seriousness because she had been a witness and now a piece of the case. Marcus took her testimony in a small, neutrally lit conference room where the walls were a color between sand and silence. He offered her a cup of apple juice and a pen, and Amani wrote in big, determined letters, the freight of a child's handwriting carrying the weight of all she had seen. The affidavit, as precise and factual as a child's memory could be, was the first legal cement. Dr. Anita Reyes came in with papers and the mild intensity of a forensic specialist who took pleasure in the work of untangling documents. She looked at the death certificates and at the official signatures like a jeweler examining a set of flawed pearls. The stamps don't align. The mortuary's accession numbers jump dates. And this signature, she said, tapping a part of the document with a careful finger, has been traced in a way that raises enough suspicion to warrant a full audit. Anita's findings were not a proof, they were an invitation. The coroner's office had files, chain of custody logs, and people who could speak to procedure. Marcus filed a motion to compel the coroner's records and to place an emergency hold on any remaining materials. He wrote with the kind of language that asked the court to pause the finality it had declared, and to recognize that truth, like a river, could undercut certainty. The motion hit the court docket and, like any public thing touched by private calamity, began to leak. Danielle Mercer, whose business it had been to manage narratives, sat in Elias's study and watched the bruised sunlight make the photo album glow. Her job was not salvage, it was choreography. Place the right words in the right ears, control the flow so that truth did not get drowned by rumor, and keep the daughter's privacy buffered by legal realities. Danielle had spent a career coaxing the press into useful shapes. She advised restraint and deliberate release, a press statement that asked for privacy, an affidavit sent under seal while the forensics were handled. "We shape the facts into a story that won't re-traumatize people," she said. "We give the press a breadcrumb and hold the rest." No plan survived human nature, especially not when one of the principals was a woman named Clarissa Hale. Clarissa's presence had never been a cameo in Elias's life. It had been a disruptive force that left small bruises on his memory.
She was a creature of performance, capable of dressing a narrative so convincingly that witnesses leaned into her version of events.
She answered Marcus's quiet petition by assembling her own counsel, and, over the following days, a counter-narrative leaked through channels Elias's team had not considered. A Channel 8 reporter, eager for a line that favored the grieving mother, ran a segment implying that Elias was grasping at hope, that his wealth bought him lawyers but not honesty. That night, an anonymous columnist suggested Elias was performing a public wake for his own convenience. The leak smelled of a hand that wanted to make pain into spectacle. The town divided in the slow way towns do, over coffee, in barbershops, on social feeds. Some believed Amani, some disbelieved the spectacle of a billionaire trying to reclaim ghosts. But inside the Hartman estate, the debate was not public. It was intimate, and at times brutal. Elias felt exposed in ways his fortune had never prepared him for. He learned that wealth made you visible and suspect in equal measure. It could buy investigations and buy time, but it could also attract an industry of doubt. Amani, meanwhile, came into the house as she had come to the bank, on her own terms. She accepted June's soup but did not let herself be domesticated. She kept a small knot of belongings in a carrier bag the way someone who travels lightly will keep treasures. A broken compass, a folded page of an old comic, a smooth penny she had found by the river. Elias watched her watch the house the first week she stayed. She sat on the edge of the hearth the way a cat might decide which corner to rule, and she watched the world of polished wood and staff meetings like a scholar assessing another culture. There were domestic shifts that felt radical in their banality. Elias, who had barely cooked since the children were small, stood at the counter to flit pancakes with a concentration that was almost worshipful. He burned a corner and laughed, a sound that had been missing in the house for a long time. Amani watched and then learned, her small hand steady as she held the spatula. June set a place for the absent girls out of habit, and Elias, when he had the courage, set a small cup of syrup on the side. It was not a restoration, it was a practice. The ritual mattered in its repetition. Between pancakes and paperwork, they watched footage. Thomas had set up lawful observation, stationary cameras positioned on public property and private spaces where consent had been obtained from adjacent homeowners. Thermal scans from a rented service that did not cross legal boundaries. The images were grainy and patient, the sort of surveillance that whispered rather than shouted. On one afternoon, slowed and sharpened, two small figures moved in the backyard of the gray house. The image did not give them faces, but it gave a posture, the angle of a ribbon, the quick, childlike tumble of movement. Marcus annotated the time and wrote emotion with the kind of legal syntax that was designed to change what courts considered fact.
The arguments in the briefs were careful, not sensational. The filings presented Amani's affidavit, Dr. Reyes's initial notes on documentary anomalies, and the surveillance stills. Marcus asked for an ex parte hearing on emergency custody and for a limited injunction preventing Clarissa from removing the girls from state jurisdiction. He couched each line in the language courts understand: likelihood of irreparable harm, immediate necessity, credible evidence. He was mindful that the law could be used to correct an error, but also that law could be used to wound. He asked for the state to act as a temporary guardian while the investigation proceeded. Clarissa's reaction was swift and theatrical. She posted a photograph of herself on a social account with a carefully captioned apology that doubled as a counter-accusation, grief and indignation braided together. She spoke of the pain the family had endured and of the cruelty of fueling false hope. Margot Vell, Clarissa's half-sister, elbowed her way into the quieter corners of this conflict. Margot was not a sympathetic character on sight. She had the practiced patience of someone who could stand in the background and make a scene move in the direction she wanted. She placed calls that arrived as thin threads of pressure, a threat couched as advice, an offer of help that always asked something in return. Her presence felt like a shadow behind glass. Then there were the anonymous intrusions, the small, precise acts of intimidation that made Elias's world feel less safe in the particular ways money cannot easily repair. An envelope, black, the kind used to hand-deliver threats in old novels, appeared on the estate's circular drive. It contained a photograph, old and creased, of a playground without faces. On the back, in a shaky hand, the word watch. A locket appeared on Elias's study desk the following morning, a small brass thing containing a lock of hair that could have belonged to any child at any time. It was not explicit. It was a message that someone watched and could reach into the curated quiet of the home. Elias did not want to escalate into a man whose default response was to build walls,
but he had daughters whose faces had been folded into paper and who might have been living in a backyard 5 blocks away. He had a child who had told him they lived by the river. He had a team advising him to move within the law. He had fear. Thomas tightened security. He recommended routes, vetted staff, and repositioned cameras. Marcus filed additional motions to enjoin the sharing of images of the girls so that their privacy could be maintained. Danielle drafted a statement designed to keep the focus on the legal process and to blunt the claws of the press. And Amani, quiet, deliberate, astonishing in her specificity, continued to draw maps in charcoal, sketching the path between the gray house and the river, placing tiny X's for the gate and for the willow tree where the girls liked to sit.
On an evening when rain had washed the neighborhood into a tone of damp steel, Elias sat on the back step and watched the river. The current moved like a sentence being written in secret, arriving and passing without regard for the reader's desires. He thought of the grave and of the lilies, and of how quickly a single piece of testimony could begin to unravel what a town had agreed upon. He thought of Amani's small face, and of the audacity of a child sleeping by the river to name what the rest of the town had folded away. There was, in the way truth makes itself known, a procedural patience. Evidence arrives slowly, a certificate with a misplaced date, a file that does not match the mortuary ledger, a neighbor who suddenly remembers a truck idling near the gray house on a night that had been marked as quiet. The team collected these things like a necklace of small, tarnished beads. None was a proof by itself. Together they sparkled. On a late November afternoon, Marcus secured a hearing date. The court would consider the emergency motion. The coroner's records would be subpoenaed. For the first time in a year and a half, there was a calendar date when the family's circumstances might be examined under official light rather than whispered around dinner tables. Elias closed the press conference with a line that felt raw even to him. "We ask only that the truth be allowed to be seen." He meant it with the unadorned insistence of a man who had learned to speak plainly when the stakes were most tender. As the legal machinery hummed, the town's undercurrents grew louder. A local blogger claimed a tip that Clarissa had used an alias on a utility bill. A former file clerk called Marcus with a rumor that a mortuary employee had been asked to expedite paperwork in a way that made him uncomfortable. Each piece of gossip required vetting because the team refused to build a case on rumor. Yet the cumulative pressure forced Clarissa's hand in ways that made her dangerous. She moved faster, and Margot's calls acquired an edge, a suggestion of things to be done that could not be undone. Amani had her own life to return to at the river each night. She would not sleep in a house she did not make a part of herself. She taught Elias how to feel the cold of the water underhandedly, the way someone might teach a new language. He learned that the kids who live by the river know the best places to find shelter from rain and to hide from people who meant harm. When she laughed, which was not often at first, but when it came, pure and sudden, it made a sound the house hadn't heard since the girls were small. But the river was also a seam that connected the two worlds in more ways than one. The gray house with the red door sat on the street above the riverbank, and its backyard sloped toward the water like a hand reaching for something it had lost. The river's edge held secrets in its reeds, and Amani's memory unfurled toward those secret places like a map. She had watched the girls drag a kite with a torn tail down the bank, and had watched them throw stones until the sound of each landing satisfied them, the way small, triumphant acts satisfy children. Those images clung to her like a second skin. A breakthrough came not as a knock on the door, but as a patient legal scouring. Dr. Reyes provided a deeper report. Signature analysis showing inconsistent pressure patterns, a ledger that revealed a gap long enough to be suspicious, emails from a mortuary tech that showed a hurried tone on the date labeled as the girl's departure. Marcus bundled these findings into a packet and submitted it to the court. It was not a smoking gun, it was a constellation. Between the filings and the surveillance, Elias tried to create small rituals that were not performances for the cameras. He and Amani built a shelf for the spare pair of shoes she had brought, and June taught the girl to fold towels with careful, almost ceremonial patience. After one long day of legal strategy, Amani found a photo album Elias had put away. She climbed onto his lap and, without comment, traced the pictures with a finger, as if drawing the faces back into the world. Elias, whose hands were used to commanding rooms, let himself be guided by the small, pragmatic motions of a child reknitting a broken garment. There were moments, too, when the machinery of power revealed its limits. An affidavit can be filed, a motion can be submitted, cameras can be positioned, but the human elements, memory, fear, affection, do not always translate easily into papers with exhibits and numbered paragraphs. Amani's voice was the hinge between those two economies. It could be transcribed, sworn, and presented, but the space between the words and the place where a father's arms might hold his children was a longer, less procedural distance. The evening before the court date, Thomas called Elias into a narrow command center they had built in a spare office. The screens showed loops of the gray house's backyard, thermal imagery of the riverbank, and a feed from a neighbor's motion camera. On one of the stills, captured just before dusk, a figure moved near the back gate. The shape was bulky and deliberate. It was enough to make a man with money feel vulnerable in a way the world seldom allowed. "We've picked up some new movement," Thomas said. "Local law enforcement is on notice. We can't make any arrests without cause, but this tells us something. Someone's been walking the perimeter." Elias stared at the grainy silhouette and felt a cold settle in his chest in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. The image didn't say who, it didn't say whether this was a gardener, a neighbor, or a threat. It only said that someone had been there. Margot's calls, Clarissa's press statements, the black envelope, all of it had the texture of a made thing. This was more immediate.
That night, after the sun had been swallowed and the house had settled around its lights, Elias went to the river alone. The bank was a half-memory, the place where he had first been told his daughters were gone, the place where Amani had told him they lived. He put his polished shoe into the mud on purpose and felt the absurdity of that gesture. He had not worn shoes like this near the river before. His life had been deliberately arranged to keep him from the world that wore mud into its seams. He thought for the first time in a long time about what it meant to cross thresholds. The river marked an edge between a city that saw and one that chose not to. It was salty with indifference and thick with secrets. Amani's whisper had been simple, and yet in it lay all the complications, that a small voice could be a lamp, that being seen by someone not in one's social orbit could alter the course of powerful things. The next morning, the papers carried a headline that smelled of rumor and money. The town argued in the small places it argued most loudly, at the bakery, on the bus, at the gym. But inside the Hartman house, the world narrowed to a docket number and to a child's charcoal map and to a surveillance feed that now showed, less grainily, two small figures passing through the back gate of the gray house. The images were not clean. They were enough. Marcus prepared to move for an ex parte custody order. He tightened his argument around the eyewitness account, the documentary anomalies, and the surveillance stills. He prayed with his own kind of legal prayer, a hope for careful justice rather than theatrical vindication. Danielle drafted language for a control press release that emphasized the family's need for privacy while acknowledging the public interest. The legal gears engaged. Judges read. Law clerks annotated. Clarissa's counsel responded with predictable outrage and a motion to quash certain evidentiary lines as hearsay. Margot's name surfaced in a report that suggested she had been in contact with a man named Raymond Leach, a fixer whose reputation leaned toward the murky side of persuasion. That name came with a heat that suggested danger without naming it. Amani, who had been an instrument in this new choreography of truth, rode the margins like someone who could not be allowed to be hurt. She continued to sleep by the river, sometimes in the lockbox by the pump, sometimes under a porch, carefully insistent that she did not want to be turned into a cause celeb. She wanted bowls of warm soup and the chance to keep the clothes that fit. She wanted, perhaps more than anything, to be believed without being paraded. On the eve of the ex parte hearing, a black envelope appeared again. It was slipped under the gate of the Hartman estate, placed like a small poisonous jewel. Inside was a photograph, an old image of a child running on a beach. The back bore a single neat message, hands off. It was not the overt threat a man might expect. It was the precise, administrative cruelty of a hand that wanted to be sure Elias knew he was not merely fighting for truth, he was in a battleground for narrative control. The photo was a message from a party that could manufacture a memory. Elias felt the house closing in. He could marshal the law and staff it with men who knew how to close doors, but the world outside his estate had its own currents. He also felt a tender absurdity that a homeless girl who slept by the river had called two names into a different order, and those names might now be the keys to unweaving a carefully staged fiction. He went to the garden, where the hydrangeas were folding into late autumn, and he thought of small rituals he would like to make permanent. He thought of planting a wisteria in the spring, and of reading a chapter of a book aloud to someone who had been living in a boat of camouflage, because the work of rebuilding would be slow and domestic and stubborn. He considered, too, the moral chore of protecting Amani. She was the moral hinge between the courts and the river, between grief and the possibility of repair, and he understood that protection would not always look like guns at a gate. It would often look like small things: a place to keep a few garments, a proper meal, a chance to be a child again. When dawn pushed the night away, the team gathered in the stately office, Marcus with files, Thomas with a map, Danielle with an iron statement, June with a thermos of coffee that smelled like relentlessness. Amani sat in the corner, knees up, the charcoal map folded on her lap. She had been asked to wait. She had done more than wait. She had carried 1,000 small, stubborn truths. She did not know what would come of the hearing, but she had offered what she had seen. They filed into court with a bundle of papers that felt heavier in their hands than any briefcase Elias had ever carried. They presented affidavit and report and pixel and human testimony. The judge, a woman with a voice that disliked melodrama, listened as Marcus spoke with the precise urgency of one who knows both the power and the limits of law. Clarissa's counsel objected to the timbre of the testimony, to the admissibility of photographic evidence captured from a private neighbor. The room was a small theater of restraint. Outside, a reporter waited for anything that might become the next day's headline. Inside, a child's charcoal map sat folded in a pocket. On a dais, the court took a breath and scheduled a limited hearing. They walked out into a late sun that had the pallor of November and the false cheer of the beginning of something. For the first time in a long while, Elias felt a direction he had not built, but had been given. The law had not yet vindicated him. It had only given him a date and a slightly more urgent timetable, but it gave him enough.
On the car ride home, Thomas handed Elias an image captured on a neighbor's doorbell camera 3 nights earlier. A man in a hooded coat stepping close to the gray house, a figure moving with the deliberate patience of someone who did not want to be seen. The frame froze on a profile that might have been Margot's associate. It was not a name, not yet, but it was emotion. Elias did not smile. He placed the phone on his knee and felt the quiet of his palms. He thought of Amani on the riverbank and of 2 small faces smiling on a tattered page. He felt, for the first time in a long time, an obligation beyond legal theater, to recover the small domestic life that had been stolen, and to shield the child who had told him the naked truth. That evening, he made pancakes again. Amani watched, then joined him at the counter with a focused seriousness that made the task ceremonial. June hummed in the kitchen and set 2 plates, one for a guest and one for ghosts in waiting. The house felt like a fragile instrument tuned to the possibility of ordinary things returning. As they sat, Thomas's phone buzzed. A text, a location ping, the sort of small, precise thing that can change a day. When he looked at the screen, his face shifted, not with the satisfaction of finding, but with the gathering of a new problem. "Someone's been seen walking the perimeter of the estate," he said quietly. "A local patrol saw him an hour ago. They will keep eyes." Elias swallowed his pancake and felt the current of the river carry the sentence away. The house around them hummed with the ordinary noises of plates and cutlery, but the doorways were now lined with plans. The legal date loomed like a clock that could not be wound back. Margot's presence remained a shadow on the margin, and now there was a man in a hood who had not yet been named. They would sleep with lights on. They would file more motions. They would hire more eyes and listen to more rumors. The river kept moving, indifferent in its continuity, and Amani's small voice, the voice that had reached him from the wrong side of town, had started something larger than either of them could yet name. Elias rose and walked back to the riverbank in the fading light. He stood where the water made a low sigh against the rock and thought of how fragile the line between remembrance and action could be. He pressed his hand against the cool stone and, without ceremony, spoke the names that had been sleeping under glass for too long. "Emma, Sophie, I'm coming." The river carried the words away, and somewhere upstream, a house with a red door sat on its foundation, seeming ordinary as any other. In a pocket, Amani kept a small penny whose face had been worn by use. She clutched it like a secret charm. In an office, a judge read a docket and thought in the language of precedent. In a garden, a black envelope lay like a bruise.
For all of that, one child's voice had become a lever, and a father who had learned to live around grief had decided to move. They had reached the point where law and human stubbornness met, not to promise immediate endings, but to make demands. The path forward would not be clean. There would be published versions and private versions, and in between those two would be the slow work of making a home into a place where small voices could be safe. The night closed around the Hartman estate as the river kept its secret pace, and the team prepared for the hearing that would determine whether a father's ritual could be replaced by the responsibility he had begun to remember. A single page of a child's drawing lay on the desk in Elias's study, a purple tree, a wavy river, and a house with a red door. He touched the pencil lines and tucked the sheet into his wallet like a charter. The river whispered on, the town argued, the courts would soon speak, and the girl who had slept by the river, who had chosen, against her own reasons for invisibility, to speak, kept watch over a secret that might become a verdict. If this scene pulled at you, leave a comment about a time a small voice changed something for you. The morning the order arrived, the air had the brittle clarity of winter sharpened by resolve. Marcus carried the judge's signature like an instrument. It was limited, urgent, a judge's temporary hand to move children out of a possibly dangerous situation. Thomas briefed the team in low, precise tones. Deputies from the county sheriff's office, a court officer, 2 family services workers with soft professional faces who would handle the initial interaction with care. Danielle arranged for the press brief to emphasize calm and to protect the children's identities. June packed a small backpack of linens and socks and a stuffed animal Elias did not know he still loved until he saw it again in a drawer. They moved as if rehearsed. The choreography of confrontation and care had been practiced in smaller ways for weeks. Elias kept his coat buttoned as if armor against the public eye, and walked to the car with a steady step that had nothing to do with the suits he wore. Amani sat in the back seat, knees to chest, the charcoal map folded and creased between her fingers like a talisman. She had been told what might happen. She had been taught how to speak to strangers who wore badges. Still, the scale of the day made her small, and smallness, when it is required to be brave, becomes another kind of courage. The gray house with the red door did not look like a crime scene. It looked at a glance like a preserved decision. Trimmed hedges, laundry lines, a child's bicycle leaning against the shed. The back gate was as Amani had drawn it, rusted at the hinge, a splintered post, and the willow tree drooped over the lawn, its thin leaves whispering in a cold wind.
Thomas walked ahead with a deputy, his posture open to indicate they bore no threat. Marcus carried the court order, stamped and binding for the limited purpose of immediate custody and a temporary protective hold. Clarissa opened the red door herself. She wore a knit sweater and that practiced look of someone who knew how to be sorrowful on cue. For a moment, a man might have felt sympathy. The muscles in Elias's jaw moved, and he kept them there. "We are here with a court order," Marcus said gently, extending the stamped page as if it might be mistaken for an innocuous document. "We need to take the children into temporary custody pending further proceedings. This is for their protection." Clarissa's face did something sharp and then controlled. "You can't just," she began. Her voice tried for indignation and failed toward something more brittle. The deputy stepped forward as family services workers asked quietly to see the girls. Behind Clarissa, a small figure emerged, Sophie, then Emma, dust on their knees, hair braided. They were not photographic illusions, but children who blinked under noonlight like real solid things. There was no theatrical scream. There was a pause, in which all the years between Elias and these girls, absences, photographs, funerals, condensed into a single breath. Sophie glanced at Clarissa, then at the man with the professional hands and tired eyes who stood in the doorway. Emma, younger by temperament if not by appearance, reached for the nearest hand and found Amani's first, then Elias's when he stepped forward. Elias knelt on the warped porch step and did what fathers do when the world rearranges itself. He made immediate, small claims. He smoothed the sleeve, tucked a strand of hair from a forehead, and said each name like the holding of a rope. There were tears that had the sound of being allowed at last. Clarissa watched from the threshold, a set of movements that could be read many ways. Relief, calculation, anger. The deputies took notes. Family services stayed close and kind. The transfer was clinical where it needed to be, and gentle where it could be. They left with the children in car seats, their hands folded over stuffed animals, and the willow tree behind them swayed as if to gesture goodbye. The neighborhood hummed with a desire for explanation. A neighbor peered through curtains and later would remember the sight of a man with a public face folding back into an ordinary father's posture. An argument would later bloom about rights and privacy and the spectacle of money. But at that moment, the most public thing in Elias's life was the steady crumple of a child's small body into his chest. Inside the estate, the reunion was not cinematic in the way the world would later demand. It had no staged music, no tidy declarations. It had a quiet kitchen with tea cooling on the counter, nightlights dimmed to the sort of warmth it could soothe. June had put out pajamas. Thomas had closed his case and sat at a distance, his watchful eyes reading the room for threats. Marcus spoke softly about the next steps: temporary guardianship, an expedited evidentiary hearing, the need for a protective order to prevent Clarissa from removing or influencing the children. Elias listened with the peculiar attention of a man who had been taught to divide his life into agendas, Now every agenda focused on what a small hand felt like in his palm. Emma leaned against his chest and smelled like sun-warmed cotton. Sophie tucked a blankie beneath her chin like a familiar economy. They had been given sugary cereal and told stories of the house they no longer owned wholly. They had not yet needed to explain words that might have hurt. Amani sat at the edge of the dining table and watched, her expression a careful ledger of pride and distance. She had been a witness, and now she was a presence who would, in small ways, be integrated into the life of the house. Good evidence does not speak in theatricality, it speaks in corroboration. After the transfer, Marcus and his team moved quickly, but with the care of those who feared litigation by outrage. They filed for the longer-term injunction. Dr. Reyes ordered a complete audit of records. A certified forensic document examiner set aside time to test the disputed signatures and to compare ink compositions and paper ages. Marcus subpoenaed the mortuary ledger and the original accession tickets, insisting on a full inventory of the chain of custody. A detective from the county attended voluntarily, his experience showing in the restrained notes he took. He arranged to interview staff from Clarissa's household under a subpoena. A gardener, a man named Luis, came forward within 48 hours. He had worked on Clarissa's property for years, and he had kept a cautious loyalty that had finally been eroded by a single small thing he could not unsee: a late-night delivery truck, a stack of boxes bearing mortuary labels, and a hurried conversation he had recorded on a phone for reasons he could not entirely explain. The tape was grainy, the voices were close and human and unacceptable. On the recording, a woman with a clipped tone, later matched by the analysts to Margot's voice, spoke about paperwork and timelines to a man with a flat, practical voice. The essence of the conversation, when transcribed and authenticated by the lab, implied deliberate orchestration, instructions about signatures, suggestions on how to present certain facts to a coroner, and a line that Marcus looked at and felt heat behind his glasses. Make sure the story doesn't leave us muddy. Clarissa's voice was not on that clip, but the call placed Margot and a fixer in an administrative position that had become criminal. The defense tried hard to exclude the tape, arguing hearsay, poor chain of custody, a phone recording made without consent.
Marcus, methodical, presented evidence of Luis's motives, the preservation of the file, and the independent forensic confirmation of the tape's authenticity. He showed a transfer log, demonstrated the minimal opportunity for contamination, and the lab's waveform analysis showed an unedited sequence. The judge allowed the tape as evidence, a careful, considered ruling that would later become the hinge of much more. In the days that followed, Clarissa filed federal countersuits and levied claims about invasion of privacy and defamation. Margot, less theatrical but more dangerous, tried to slip into the background, even as her whispering network stepped up. Raymond Leach, whose reputation lay in the spaces between persuasion and crime, moved in the periphery. Phone records showed his communications with Margot. The county detective convened with federal agents when signatures, if proven forged, spoke to paperwork crossing state lines. The situation became an investigation with multiple tracks: civil custody, criminal fraud, potential obstruction. Threats escalated in ways that were pointedly legalistic. An array of hacked anonymous online accusations splashed across feeds. A whistleblower document appeared in a blog, claiming to reveal Elias's, quote, pattern of self-promotion around grief, end quote. Anonymous deliveries continued, a child's shoe placed on a doorstep, a note folded into a book Elias had been reading. None of them spoke of physical violence. They were crafted to unsettle, to weaponize public opinion. Danielle moved quickly, arranging a press window that stressed protection and waiting for facts. "We don't feed rumors," she told a reporter who wanted spectacle. "We report outcomes." Margot's behavior altered from insinuation to motion. She sent a lawyer to meet with Clarissa, who insisted she had been set up, who whispered of mistakes and grief that curdled into strange decisions. But investigators had a new lead, an associate of Raymond Leach, a man who had recently been arrested on an unrelated matter and who, in a moment of bargaining, offered names and dates. He provided a route. Margot reached out to a mortuary tech and a temp who had been paid to adjust paperwork. He described using cash to move things faster. He described Leach's manner: practical, efficient, willing to be the hands for unpleasant tasks. With these threads, prosecutors convened. A grand jury subpoenaed records, and the state filed charges: fraud, falsification of death records, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, and later isolated counts of custodial interference. Clarissa was named in an indictment for her alleged part in procuring forged documents. Margot and Raymond found themselves in cuffs, charged as co-conspirators. It is seldom that legal work reads like a tidy story. Charges can be amended, plea bargains offered, but the direction had changed. The river had begun, in small bureaucratic ways, to erode the false earth built over truth.
There was one more piece Marcus needed: explicit evidence that tied Clarissa to the operational choices, not just the narrative of grief, but the orchestration. The phone records showed calls in the margins. The mortuary ledger showed rushed entries. Luis's recording suggested instructions. What they lacked was a confession or direct admission. Then a detail arrived, almost accidentally, that would become central. A voicemail left on Margot's phone by Clarissa, recorded in the morning after the supposed accident, that said in a voice threadbare with dread, "Make it look like the storms took them. Use the paperwork. Do what we rehearsed." The phone company produced metadata tying the call to Clarissa's line. Forensic audio analysts matched voice patterns. It was the admission Marcus had sought, not theatrical in confession, but practical in direction. At the arraignment, Clarissa watched the courtroom as if measuring light. She pleaded not guilty. Her lawyer argued the voicemail had been taken out of context. Margot's defense argued that Luis had motives to lie. In a courtroom, the work of narratives becomes literalized into timelines and exhibits. Evidence was presented, the mortuary ledgers with altered accession numbers, email chains showing someone mandated to expedite paperwork, Luis's sworn affidavit and his original phone containing the recording. A federal agent testified about the chain of custody and the importance of maintaining evidentiary integrity. The press room, meanwhile, had its own rhythm. Danielle insisted on one statement and stuck to it. The family sought truth and privacy. She deflected the tabloids and made sure that no images of the girls were published without court permission. That restraint, in the end, controlled the optics. They reached a day that felt like a hinge. The trial, if trials are to be called such, was less about theatricality and more about the accumulation of small, verified facts. Marcus worked the exhibits like a man assembling a quilt, each patch necessary, each seam proving its neighbor. He played Luis's recording, the one with Margot's voice steering an operation of obfuscation. The courtroom felt silent, in the way rooms with good air do when something true happens. The sound of the tape was ordinary in itself, voices in conversation, but its contents were a precise turning of a page. Then the evidence brought something more immediate, an audio file captured unintentionally by a nanny who had been picking up leave-behind messages on a shared household phone. The nanny, tearful in the witness chair, testified that she had saved a message in which Clarissa was heard discussing document alterations with Margot and expressing a desire to make sure the children were safe from publicity. The phrasing, prosecutors' counsel argued, was a thin veil over the concrete instructions the defense would later try to wash away.
Clarissa's remorse, when later presented, read as performance to some and as genuine grief to others. The jury, however, did not need theatrical confession. They needed corroboration. They had it. In the end, the recorded voices did not stand alone. They were buoyed by the ledger evidence, by emails, by witness testimony, by the mortuary's acknowledgement of irregularities, and by the procedural anomalies flagged by Dr. Reyes. The verdict read not as a moral condemnation, but as the government's assessment that a set of actions had crossed legal boundaries. Clarissa was convicted on counts that ranged from fraud to falsification. The sentencing considered both her role and the collateral damage of the scheme. She received a custodial sentence shorter than some wanted, and a restitution order. More importantly, the court found that the death certificates had been improperly obtained and ordered corrections in official registries. Margot and Raymond faced stiffer penalties. Raymond's past made him an easier target for prosecutors who sought to carve a clear ledger of wrongdoing. They were both sentenced. The legal system, by necessity, relied on law's own increments: arraignment, indictment, trial, sentencing. Justice, in this case, arrived in measured steps rather than in a cinematic crescendo. For Elias and the girls, the verdict felt like a permission to rebuild without a complicating villain lurking unaccountable at the edges. There was fallout. Social feeds bristled with takes, some sympathetic, some cruel. Anonymous letters continued for a time, their messages dulled by the fact of arrests. There were days when Elias opened the mail and found small comforts: cards from neighbors, a child's drawing delivered anonymously by someone who had once been indifferent. There was one article that imagined Elias as avaricious, and another that called him a redeemer. The town's conversation moved on, in the way towns do, to the weather, the new mayoral candidate, the football team's success. The human story remained, complex and private, behind closed doors. Inside, the work of healing was domestic and stubborn. The girls returned to routines that resembled the old ones, but were not identical. They chose their own pajamas, they argued about seating at dinner, they relearned trains of thought that threaded with homework and friends. There were nights when one of them would start awake and call for a parent, and Elias, in the middle of a night heavy with responsibilities, would come blinking into the hallway to anchor them with a hand on a shoulder. Amani, helped in small ways, fetching lost socks, teaching the girls a card game she knew from the river. June supervised morning cereal like a quietly authoritative general. They built new rituals:
On Saturdays, Elias took time to pancake, not as a show, but out of deliberate repetition.
He burned edges sometimes and laughed the small laugh that had been missing for years. The girls teased him about a particular flip he did too theatrically. Bedtime stories became a shared commission, evenings when Elias read aloud, and the girls fell into the cadence of the language and the quiet of small lungs. Amani would sometimes sit on the stairs and listen. Sometimes she would curl up in the reading nook and rest her head against a cushion. The river remained a motif. On Sundays, Elias walked its bank with all that remained cautious and mended. The girls came once in a while, arms looped in small conspiracies. They told him how they used to make boats out of leaves, and how sometimes, if the wind was right, the kite their mother had left behind would catch on a reed. On one bright morning, they took small sticks and tossed them into the water, measuring how far the current would take them. The act was ordinary. Its ordinariness held the miracle. Margot and Raymond's capture had not been accidental. Marcus and Thomas, working with county deputies, had arranged a legal sting. They learned Margot planned to retrieve a payment for services rendered under the guise of settling an old invoice. A warrant had been issued, and a court-approved operation set. Police, with search orders in hand, watched from behind cedars in Elias's garden, while Amani and Elias agreed to be present as quiet actors in a legal theater of truth. The garden, usually a place of hydrangeas and small pleasures, became a stage for arrest. Margot arrived with a small, polite detachment, Raymond with a look that tried to be blank. When deputies moved in, they did so within the law, their movements the precise choreography of restraint and authority. Margot's surprise was human, not cinematic. She did not run but argued, her voice thin with the realization that the options had closed. The case went beyond headline arrests. The mortuary admitted to sloppy practices and faced fines. The coroner's office updated procedures for accession logs. Officials instituted a review of protocols for death certifications, and as a result, several jurisdictions tightened oversight. For Elias, these institutional ripples felt like a small vindication, not solely for his daughters, but as a correction of a system that had allowed time and formality to outrun human realities. Trial and conviction could not stitch everything at once. There were broken threads that required patience. The girls had questions that required gentle, honest answers at the level they could carry. They wanted to know why people would lie, why their mother was in court, why strangers had opinions about their lives. Marcus and the social workers recommended therapy. June made appointments with a children's counselor known for ordinary, matter-of-fact kindness. The counselor did not promise miracles, only work, a place to voice confusion, to practice saying names without being reduced to headline fodder.
The slow work of repair also involved the physical. They planted a wisteria vine along the side of the estate the following spring, a deliberate act. Elias chose the spot himself, by the back pergola where the house met the garden. The plant was a small thing, a tender shoot with a few leaves. It would take years to climb and to curl and to bloom in the purple chains Elias imagined. Planting it was symbolic and practical. It would one day be shade. The girls each took a turn pressing soil around the roots. Amani held the watering can with a careful seriousness that made the moment sacred in its ordinariness. They did other small things too, a photo album with new pages where no one had been expected, a small bedside lamp for Emma that clicked on like a promise. Sophie used stickers to create a border around a drawing she had made of a kite. The house learned to breathe in new rhythms. Elias learned to sit through a cartoon with a child on his lap. He learned that patience in parenting could feel like repair, slow, repetitive, and not glamorous. There were unexpected reconciliations. June, who had seen the family through routinized labor and steadfastness, gained a new measure of authority and decision-making. Amani received a school placement and an assigned social worker to help manage the transition from river nights to classroom desks. The child who had been a witness retained her dignity. She refused to be a curiosity, and instead accepted, carefully, the sort of nurture that permitted autonomy. Elias provided money for a small fund, no televised gifts, no grand gestures, in which to pay for the girl's tutoring and to ensure she had warm clothes. He asked advice from June about what constituted thoughtful help. The answers were small and practical. Time did what time does, which is not to erase but to rearrange. On a warm afternoon months later, they held a quiet celebration in the garden. No cameras, only a few people, marking perhaps not an ending, but a public marking of a new chapter. There was a cake with frosting too sweet for some tastes, and a small banner Elias could have found in a craft store. The wisteria had grown enough to show promise, slender shoots coiling toward the pergola. Anna and Sophie ran through the lawn with the sort of braids that a child can only wear when someone bothers to braid them. They shrieked and laughed and sometimes collapsed in a heap of contentment. Amani sat on the lawn and watched, the corner of her mouth lifting sometimes, as if this had been what she had expected, this practical pleasure of a life stabilized. The final legalities settled like dust. Clarissa served her time.
Margot and Raymond faced penalties. Civil remedies were pursued for the family. The state corrected records. Prosecutors closed their cases, satisfied they had proven wrongdoing beyond a reasonable doubt. The public watched and then folded the story into other headlines.
What remained for the Hartmans was daily reclamation, the slow threading of trust, the practice of bedtime stories, the rebuilding of a family album with new pages and new annotations. Elias, who had once paced the rooms of the house like a man in a prison of his own making, began to measure life in different units, a child's laugh across a kitchen, the way a hand finds another in the night, the new habit of leaving a small cup of cold milk on the stairs for a child who might pass through. He learned that protection could be small and continuous rather than large and theatrical. He learned to sign as a father with presence rather than with papers. Amani, who had been the hinge of the whole strange movement, continued to live nearby. She enrolled in school and occasionally visited the kitchen where pancakes were made with dedicated, imperfect ceremony. She accepted gifts only when they felt like gifts and not bribes. She practiced carpentry with Thomas's workshop people on weekends and sometimes taught the girls a game she had learned by the river. Her life did not dissolve into the Hartman story. It became part of the neighborhood's history, a thread woven in with careful respect. One late spring evening, when the wisteria had unfurled a womanly first bracelet of purple, Elias planted another small thing, a pollinator-friendly bed beneath the pergola where the vine was determined to climb. He and the girls, along with Amani, pushed soil and steadied seedlings and laid down a few stones that could mark a path. They set a small plaque, not for the public but for themselves. Here we keep watch. On a quiet afternoon, the family walked to the river. The bank felt different now, less a barrier between two worlds than a seam where lives met. The girls skipped stones, while Amani taught them a knot for fastening a kite's tail. Elias watched them and felt the old ache reconfigure into something tolerable and clear. He thought of that first morning, when a girl with river grass in her hair had said, simply and with the frankness of survival, "They live by the river near where I sleep." He thought of the way a small voice had altered the course of his life. Justice had happened in the measured way law allows, and healing had arrived in the patient way life requires. The press would for a time remember the story of a billionaire who had been made human and a homeless girl who had spoken a truth that mattered. In private, the family kept a tradition. Every year on the day that court had authorized custody, they planted something, an herb, a flower, a small bush, so that growth would mark the calendar more than grievance. The story did not close with perfection. There remained scars that would be visible in certain lights, a bedtime that sometimes required an explanation to friends, a day when a headline would resurface and reopen a small wound. But the larger arc bent toward a careful hope.
The girls learned to laugh without the shadow of being a story first. Amani kept her autonomy and the quiet pride of having spoken. Elias learned to be present and to admit he did not have all the answers. On the final page of the new album, Elias placed a photograph of the family by the river, not staged, not glamorous, just a man with two girls and a girl who had once slept on the bank, their feet muddied, the sky wide and honest above them. In the corner of the photo, a small kite flew, like a promise. Months later, as the house settled into a rhythm measured by ordinary responsibilities, Elias sat at his desk and put the purple tree drawing, Amani's map, into a new envelope, along with the court papers that had closed the last chapter. He tucked them into a box labeled Records, and for reasons that felt almost superstitious, slipped the smooth penny she had carried into the pocket of his coat. He kept the penny not as a talisman, but as a reminder of the peculiar economy of truth, how a small thing can alter the dynamics of powerful systems. The river kept moving, indifferent in its continuity, but it was no longer solely a seam between two unequal worlds. It had become, in the way life sometimes offers, a place of connection. On the far bank, a child flew a kite. On this bank, two girls and a man watched it rise, and remained, finally, in a place where ordinary things, pancakes on a Saturday, a bedtime story, a vine climbing toward purple, could be the slow work of repair. If this story resonated, share it with someone who believes small voices matter.